All right, class. Hope you're all doing well. I'm going to talk a little bit today about a modest proposal. Now, usually when students read this text, I get a lot of funny looks in a seated class. Sometimes in an online class, I get some strange emails from students like, what are you thinking? What is this? Why would you make us read such a barbaric and horrifying text? And I promise at the end of this discussion, I hope it'll make more sense. I think it will. But in order to really access the text, we first have to talk about some of the context, right? Remember, the key to understanding any work of literature is understanding something about the context in which it was produced. So I'm just going to share an image with you. You may recognize these two countries. Well, there are several countries actually depicted here if you want to get technical. This is England and Ireland, also sometimes called the British Isles. And if you know anything about the history of these two islands and their relationship to one another, it's not very good. The one on the right here, which is England, colonized Ireland for the better part of 1,000 years, really. And they colonized, they set up shop, they set up landlords, and they basically extorted the farming production of Ireland for many hundreds of years. And this created a really, really bad relationship between the English and Irish, and there are a lot of contributing factors to that, other than just the colonial effort. Also, there were religious differences. The English were primarily Anglican, which is a form of the of Protestantism, a variation of Christianity. And then, of course, the Ireland is primarily Catholic, which is the original variation of Christianity. And they did not see eye to eye because of these differences, because of also some mild genetic distinctions. The Irish tend to be more Celtic, whereas the British tend to be more Anglo-Saxon. And if you want to get into the complex history of what those terms mean, you can. So referring again to colonialism, colonialism is the practice of moving into another country and setting up shop and then extorting that country for its resources. In the case of Ireland, it was used as a farming colony for Britain, and specifically they produced a lot of what they called barreled beef, which prior to refrigeration, barreling beef with certain preservative agents was a way to preserve meat. And to ensure that you could ship it long distances and that kind of thing. You know, before they invented the refrigerator, how do you preserve your meat? You got to come up with some other ways. So Ireland suffered a long time under British rule, and there were a lot of conflicts. There were a lot of wars, skirmishes. There was a guy named Oliver Cromwell who killed a lot of Irish people, and they weren't too happy about it. And there were a lot of other instances. The text that we read, Modest Proposal, was written in 1729, which is actually before the Great Potato Famine. But the Great Potato Famine was technically caused by Britain as well, because even though the Irish peasantry starved as a consequence of the potatoes getting a blight and dying off, had the British not shipped out enough food to feed the entire island, the famine would not have happened. So this is a very complex social relationship. And it's one where you have a country that is causing the problem and a country that is on the receiving end of the problem. And the country that is causing the problem is not aware that it doesn't really care that it is doing this. The attitude of the British people towards the Irish people was one of pomp and arrogance, and they saw the Irish people as being inferior, as being unruly, and mostly to blame for their own suffering. Of course, this, when you consider the fact that they were being extorted for their food, this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But as it stands, this conflict between these two island nations is one of the worst conflicts on Earth. You have a series of conflicts on Earth of people that just really don't like each other. The Armenians and the Turks, the Palestinians and the Israelis. And you can throw in such conflicts the Irish and the British. And it is such a long-lasting feud, and it is so steeped in generations of violence and hatred that it did not end. Technically, you might say it's not over. There's still some tension. But in my lifetime, they were shooting at each other. I can remember in the 90s when a ceasefire was finally reached in the northern provinces, which remained under British control much longer than the rest of the Irish country. So Considering this difficult political situation, you have a group of people that will not listen to reason. That is the British aristocracy that is causing the suffering of the Irish people. So the question is, what do you do? We read some other texts previously, specifically The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. And in The Lottery, we saw that she was showing the people their own dark side, right? She was showing them their own evil face, so to speak, and they didn't really like that. And so you have this other option when you've got a audience that is very sure of themselves and very convinced of their own superiority. You have the option of shocking them into the realization that they are in fact no better than everyone else. This is what The Lottery did through the situation of the stoning, a very primitive punishment in a very modern time of the American small town. And in the case of A Modest Proposal, that's exactly what Swift is doing. So, to put some of you at ease, no, this is not a text which literally advocates for the eating of Irish babies, okay? That is not what he really means. This is what's called a satire. A satire is a type of text that uses humor, irony, and ridicule to achieve a specific message, usually a political one, or one that leans politically. So in the case of Mr. Swift, he was an Anglican British man, so he was loyal to Great Britain, but he was living in Ireland, okay? And as a consequence of living in Ireland, he was unable to do the out of sight, out of mind thing that most people are able to do in this kind of circumstance. He was exposed to the terrible suffering of the Irish peasantry, and it was really, really bad. People were starving. They were afflicted by disease. There were single mothers with multiple children and all sorts of horrible things. And if you could find work, it was in really poor conditions. The British landlords would set up workhouses and stuff on their land, and Irish peasants would work and live in these houses, sometimes hundreds of people to a single building. You have like a room full of beds with buckets at the end of the beds. I'll let you fill in the blank on what the buckets are for. But this is just not a good situation. And if you live there, it's not like you can put your head in the sand and forget about it. So you have this British citizen who lives among all this suffering, knows that his country is causing it, and yet all of his attempts to reach the British conscience have failed. And not just him, everyone else that tried to reach the British conscience in this way didn't seem to be working. The British had such a poor opinion of the Irish that there was no convincing them of their own malignancy in this way. So Mr. Swift decided to write this satire wherein he, in his modest proposal, which is anything but modest, suggests that in order to fix the problem of poverty in Ireland, that the British people should simply eat the Irish babies, that it will be a fine supply of meat, and it will take care of the problem of there being too many papists, he says, or too many Catholics. So you see how he plays into those religious differences and kind of mocks them. So it's interesting, if you know this text is a satire. Now, I asked you not to look it up beforehand, but maybe some of you did. If you know this text is a satire prior to reading it, you can kind of see where it's using humor and things. Like there are jokes in it. For example, where does he get the idea for cannibalism? From an American man, right? Because Americans at this point in time are very rough and tumble and they live in the woods. So they would be the ones who are most likely to eat babies. If you know anything about Benjamin Franklin, sometimes he would wear a coonskin hat when he was doing his work as a diplomat in France, because he was playing into the European idea that Americans were rough and tumble. They were rough around the edges, and they would do things like wear dead raccoons on their head and, of course, maybe even eat some questionable things, right? So there's a little bit of humor there. He also says that he would set up a statue of himself as a preserver of the nation, or of anyone that could solve the problem, and then, of course, make such a radical suggestion. And there are other jokes as well, like the one about there being more papish infants 9 months after Lent. Now, that's a very complicated joke, and you have to understand it, really. Lent is the period of abstinence that Catholics observe before Holy Week. It's supposed to mirror the time in which Christ renounced, he fasted in the desert and talked to the devil and all that weird stuff for 40 days before he entered Jerusalem on a donkey. So to commemorate that fasting, or that abstaining from food or drink or whatever, during the month of Lent, it is customary for Catholic people to give something up. Okay, usually something that they like. Sometimes it's TV, sometimes it's beer or something like that, chocolate. Other times it's something a little more carnal, right? Maybe sometimes they would give up sex, right? So when Lent is over, all bets are off, and 9 months after that, you have lots of babies. So now you understand the joke, right? And you can see the humor. But he convinced you that he was telling the truth because of the way he broke the numbers down. He had how many infants would be born, how many would be lost in childbirth, how many would reach adolescence, and all this stuff. And he broke all of this stuff down in a way where you're like, is this guy serious? Right? Is he really serious? Another thing I want you to consider is the nature of the specific taboo that he's embracing. Now, when I say taboo, that means something that is socially unacceptable. And if you look at taboos, they develop for different reasons. Some taboos develop for good reasons. Like, let's try to come up with an example. You might say that some of the dietary stipulations of Judaism, like, for example, don't eat shellfish. Well, you guys know that if you eat bad shellfish, you can be very sick. I don't think it's a far cry to suggest that that may have developed as a consequence of someone eating shellfish and getting really sick, and then someone going, you know what, we should really write down that we shouldn't eat that kind of shellfish. So that taboo develops over time as a consequence of a very real, measurable thing that happened as a result of doing this. Some taboos are completely arbitrary. The Yazidi people who live in Iraq, actually, they are Kurdish people, they don't eat lettuce. They refuse to eat lettuce. They can't even be in the same room as lettuce. And the reason being is because lettuce has a similar vowel sound to an insult that is used against their god. They have a they have a very, what's the term I'm looking for? It's an unusual religion. I mean, I don't mean it as like bad in a bad connotation when I say weird. I mean, it's not like a very normal religion. It's kind of strange, and it's an amalgamation of all these different things. And their god has qualities that some people feel are negative, and so they have insults for him. And a lot of those insults contain the same vowel sounds as the word for lettuce. So they don't eat lettuce. So some taboos are arbitrary, some taboos have meaning. In the case of cannibalism, I think it's pretty obvious why we don't do it, right? It's unthinkable to eat something that is similar to yourself, right, in that way, another human being. A lot of species on Earth actually do practice cannibalism, and we are one of them, but we don't like to admit it. It's not a very common thing. It happens in certain circumstances. There have been cultures where cannibalism is culturally accepted, which is a very strange thing to consider. But in any case, when you embrace this taboo, this is like one of the worst things there is, right? If you listed off all of the worst taboos in the world that are just unthinkable to most people, this would be one of them. So to accuse the British nobility, these people who generally think very highly of themselves because of their status in the world, they were able to conquer most of the known world for a while. I mean, not most of it, but a lot of it. The saying goes, the sun never sets on the British Empire, right? So they obviously think that they they think highly enough of themselves that they believe that other people deserve to have their culture forced upon them, which implies a certain amount of hubris. If you take someone of that level of self-importance and you accuse them of one of the worst conceivable sins that you can possibly think of, that is no small thing. So I want you to imagine the response that was generated by this text. How do you think the people at whom this satire was targeted felt as a consequence of reading it? Probably not very good, right? Probably very outraged and annoyed. So then we go back to think about the text from Dr. King, where he talked about the uneasy tension and how tension is necessary for growth. Does not this text create tension? I would say it certainly does. Probably some of you were tense from reading it. And is that tension useful? Did Mr. Swift contribute to the social conscience of the British people? I think it's fair to say he did. Now, of course, this didn't end the problems. 100 years later, you get the potato famine, which was probably the worst, one of the worst consequences of British colonialism upon the Irish people. So it didn't solve the problem, but today things are much better, and this is widely understood to be a very accurate text in its accusations. And so just think about the power of language. Think about how each of the short texts that I've asked you to read thus far has shown you the power of language and what you can do with language, and maybe things that you don't necessarily consider. If you can't reason with people in good faith and you can't use logic to reach them, You have other tools at your disposal. Now, they may not be very popular, right? You may get a lot of criticism and flack for using some of these tools, but you have them nonetheless. And if you can't get people to understand what they're doing, maybe you can shock them awake and into maybe considering their position, or at the very least trying to prove you wrong. I'm not that bad. I'll show you. I'll be so nice to the Irish, you won't even know. So this is it's an interesting text, and it's ironic because as I'm recording this video, it is St. Patrick's Day, which is the feast day of the Irish patron saint, St. Patrick. So it's kind of funny that this is how. I swear it's a coincidence. This was not intentional. Some things I want to leave you thinking about. I like to show you that there's a way in which you might actually be like the British people. Not like the landlords and stuff that have all the power, but there's a way in which you are complacent in the system in the same way the average person in Britain was. You think about what are some things that you or your country or your political system or whatever are causing that you are disconnected from and that you don't usually think about. Think about how your clothes are made. Who makes your clothes, right? A lot of times these are adolescent children in very poor conditions, sweatshops and stuff like that. Do you ever think about that when you wear the Tommy Hilfiger and all of the, brand name clothing? Do you ever think about where it was made? That's the only brand name. What other brand is there? Gucci. I don't know. I'm the least acquainted with fashion in the world, so I'm probably making a complete fool of myself right now. But that stuff, all that stuff that we just really love, and we buy so much of it, and it's a status symbol. It's made by people who live really kind of miserable lives by comparison to our own in many cases, at least in the physical sense. Also consider the iPhone in your pocket, the silicone parts and things like that. Where were those made? Well, they were made in factories in places like Indochina and places like that, where some of the conditions are so bad that Apple, the company Apple that produces the phones, has put what they call suicide nets in some of their factories, wherein these nets have been installed to keep people who are working in these factories from deciding they've had enough and climbing up to the rafters and throwing themselves off. This is a very depressing subject, but it should show you that how is the condition of those factories really is it that wildly different from the condition of the Irish? I mean, we'd have to go tit for tat and weigh the suffering, and that would be very hard. But you can see where you're not exposed to this pain. You don't see these people. You don't have to go and tour the factories or anything. It's out of sight, out of mind. So what would happen if someone wrote a satire that exposed you as in the way that Jonathan Swift exposed the British? Now, I'm not saying you're personally accountable for any of this stuff, no more than me or anyone else, but it's something to think about. It's something to think about, that out of sight, out of mind, or, what is it? How much say do we really have in the way that our society controls itself? And if we all suddenly became aware of these things, would they get better? It's just an interesting thing to think about. Don't want to foist any guilt on anybody. That's not my intention. But hopefully you found this text interesting, and hopefully now you no longer want to see me terminated from my position of employment for assigning something so grotesque and awful. There was a method to the madness, as Hamlet says. There was a reason behind it. So I hope that you found it interesting. I hope you found all these short texts interesting, and have a great weekend. And I will see you next time.